Hello and welcome. It has been a while since releasing a new video. The 3 previous series of videos were done in a relatively close span of time. I really wanted to get that information released as fast as possible. It was a lot of effort, but then I took a break to observe how the videos were received. If there was not much interest, it did not make sense to continue. I released the information on multiple platforms. They have seen a modest amount of interest over the past 6 months. I do not have other social media accounts, so I depend on sharing and word of mouth. If you find this information useful and truthful, please consider sharing links to these videos in your circle of influence. I noticed that just recently something must have tweaked some increased interest, as a lot of views have happened over the past week. That is very encouraging, and I hope to find out exactly what it was that got that interest. But that has also encouraged me to again release more of my research. If you've gone through my previous videos, you see I'm navigating a pretty fine line. These topics have centuries of tradition built up around them. Many wise and learned people have written much that has shaped our understanding, and even in the recent modern times there are popular teachers who have great numbers of followers who accept their various teachings as absolute biblical fact. However, just because many people believe something is true doesn't necessarily mean it is. Everything must be examined to verify if it aligns with all of God's rules and plans. But then there are those others who do not take accepted teachings at face value and do question them. However, many of these people take things too far and insert their biases and assumptions, and this leads to wild speculation and systems which are plainly heretical. So we must be careful of accepting alternatives just because we know that tradition may be wrong. So this is what I mean when I say I'm navigating a fine line. There is much value in examining our generally accepted traditions. However, when some error is identified, and there is evidence to back those claims up, many people have difficulty accepting this. It can threaten their shaky foundations and ego too much. They quickly bring up those who have been shown to have heretical teachings and have gone too far in their personal interpretations. They paint everything by that one very big brush. They do not allow for the possibility that they may have a flawed understanding and that there is a narrow truth that has finally been identified which is actually correct. It's been 15 years since I first tried to get in contact with these type of popular teachers and present my research that there are alternate solutions which very well might be the correct way to interpret things. However, to date, not a single teacher, expert, or pastor will give me the time of day. 15 years of rejections and being ignored. But I am encouraged by a few responses I've had recently to these videos where viewers like yourself do see the research showing that these alternate interpretations have much value and could very well be correct. I hope to hear more feedback from those of you who have carefully considered what I have presented. But let's talk about the topic for this presentation. In my series about the rediscovery of the accurate biblical Jewish calendar, I offered various evidences that the calendar has been modified and that the modern calendar rules cannot be used to accurately date historical events. I mentioned that there were evidences in the writings of Josephus. That was not the main topic, and so I did not elaborate at that time. In this presentation, I want to go back to one of those pieces of evidence and present it in detail. I'll remind you briefly how the calendar works. The Jewish calendar is a Luni-Solar calendar. That is, it is based on the phases of the moon and uses the sun to keep it synchronized with the seasons. Each month starts with the new moon phase and can be either 29 or 30 days long. 12 of these months average to 354 days. Since that is less than the length of a solar year, that is 365 and a quarter days, each year slips earlier and earlier into the previous season. After 3 years, the lunar year has lost an entire month as compared with the solar year. So every 2 or 3 years, an extra month is added, an intercalary month. This is done before the month of Nisan, which is the beginning of the religious year, the month that contains Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. This pattern of an additional month every 2 to 3 years makes up a cycle of 19 years and is called the Metonic cycle. This cycle has been in its current form since at least 350 AD, when the current modern calendar rules were officially released. However, how do we know that the current Metonic 19-year cycle was operating before that date? Since there can be a period of 3 years between each possible intercalary month, how do we know that the pattern was not shifted 1 or 2 years? This is extremely important information to know if one wants to date historical events before 300 AD. If the Metonic cycle was not operating according to the modern cycle and was actually offset by 1 or 2 years, then dates could potentially be 1 month off of when they actually occurred in history. And this is what my research has proven. Many biblical scholars and researchers do not recognize this important problem with the modern Jewish calendar, and that is amazing to me. But as I stated at the start, this is one of those accepted traditions which many take at face value and do not investigate further. And when the evidences that I have discovered are presented, they cannot or will not accept it. Most likely it would destroy the house of cards that they have developed. One of the most important sources for this is from the work of the Muslim scholar Al-Biruni. It seems it is not widely recognized. I went into great detail in my previous presentation. However, the historian Josephus also contains evidence that the Metonic cycle was not operating according to the modern calendar, but was actually shifted 1 year previous. It is indirect evidence, but it is very convincing. Let's look at his discussion of the time of Herod and the death of Tiberius. Herod the Tetrarch and his friends went up to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice to God, an ancient festival of the Jews being then just approaching. And when he had been there and been honorably entertained by the multitude of the Jews, he made a stay there for 3 days, within which time he deprived Jonathan of the high priesthood and gave it to his brother Theophilus. But when on the 4th day letters came to him, which informed him of the death of Tiberius. And you can find this in Antiquities of the Jews. So here we have a timeline which has some very exact dates. Notice that he says that Herod arrived in Jerusalem at the time of a Jewish festival. He was there 4 days when he received news from Rome that Tiberius had died. We can determine this exact date in history. We can find when Tiberius died. We can then look at the Jewish festival dates and find the one that is closest to this time of year. So let's do that. The death of Tiberius has been dated to March 16th, 37 AD. Now let's find out what date this is using the modern Jewish calendar rules. According to the converter found on midrash.org, March 16th, 37 AD was on Nisan the 12th. The converter at abdicate.net says the date was Nisan the 10th. The Jewish festivals which occur in the spring is the grouping of Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. Passover, as the start of the festival, always begins on Nisan 14 every year. So with the death occurring on Nisan 10, or at the latest Nisan 12, is it actually possible for the news to travel from Rome to Jerusalem by Nisan 18th, which is about 6 days? I would think that it would be highly unlikely, actually impossible. But there is actually a further bit of information that tells us that it was not possible. In the discussion about first fruits, we discovered that there was a requirement to have ripe barley in order for the priest to wave it before the Lord on that day. Barley does not ripen until after the spring equinox in that part of the world. The dates of March 16th to 20 do not allow for ripe barley to be available. An intercalary month would have to be added that year, which would push the feasts out 30 days into the next month. That year must have had an additional month added. Since the modern Jewish calendar rules do not allow for an intercalary month for that year, we know that the rules are inaccurate. This is the proof that we cannot use the modern calendar to provide accurate dates for this year. A different Metonic cycle was in operation during that time. And as I've shown, and mathematically proven, the Metonic cycle based on the ripeness of the winter barley results in a different cycle being in operation for the surrounding centuries. This different cycle does provide for an accurate historical date and allows for the information that Josephus records to work correctly. Therefore, Tiberius died on March 16th, 37 AD, and the news of his death arrived in Jerusalem about 5 weeks later, during the time of the main spring religious festivals, and not 1 week later, as the modern Jewish calendar rules would have us believe. This evidence also proves that the very common assumption that Jesus Christ died on the cross 4 years earlier, in 33 AD, is also in error. That assumption is also based on using the modern calendar rules. However, if one uses the rules based on the ripeness of the winter barley, the death of Jesus accurately occurred in 31 AD. If you haven't watched my presentation, which includes additional evidences, please watch the 2-part series, The Date Hidden from History. This has been a shorter video. I wanted to present a single topic in detail. I hope to do similar videos in the future giving further insights into the topics I have already presented. There is so much information, and I had to limit the previous presentations to just the most relevant evidence. Some of the topics I'm considering are a deeper dive into what the covenant is in Daniel 9. Also, who were the Magi, and the discovery that they were prophesied about in the Old Testament, and how the timeline in Revelation should be understood. I'm also considering a series of videos which are responses to misunderstandings by popular prophecy teachers. If you have suggestions of what you'd like to see first, let me know. Or if there are things which are not clear in these videos and you'd like more information, I can also consider that. There's lots to talk about.